I never thought I'd see my name on a wedding registry. That wasn't mine. It had been a long week at the library, and I was balancing my regular shifts with picking up a few extra hours cataloging donations from the autumn book drive. I'd just gotten home, our modest duplex nestled off a quiet street in Waverly, Indiana, and was settling in for a quiet evening. The house smelled like cinnamon from the apple cider I'd left simmering in the slow cooker. Fall has always been my favorite time of year. Cool winds, golden leaves, and a sense of beginnings rather than endings. I'd been saving for a long time, years actually. Every birthday card from Grandma with a check tucked inside. Every weekend tutoring session I did in college. Every dollar I didn't spend on takeout or movie nights. It had all gone into that savings account, meant for one thing, a down payment on a small house. Not a big place, just something safe and steady I could call mine. So when I overheard Mom on the phone with Aunt Jeannie that afternoon, I froze. "She'll be fine, Jeannie. Natalie doesn't need all that money just sitting there. Evelyn and Mark are starting their life together. This is their moment." I remember standing in the kitchen, my hands trembling, a dish towel still clutched in one of them. My mother's voice carried from her bedroom, calm, decisive, and utterly unapologetic. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I logged into my online banking that night, heart pounding. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But when I checked the detailed transaction history, there it was. 2 withdrawals, a week apart, totaling nearly everything I had saved. $38,000 gone. I sat there in the dark, the screen glowing in front of me like it might blink out the truth. It didn't. I felt a strange stillness at first, like my brain couldn't quite catch up with what I'd just seen. Then the heat rushed in. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. Evelyn had always been the favorite. I used to tell myself I was imagining it, just the usual big sister jealousy. But then there were the piano recitals where only her trophies got polished and displayed. The birthday cakes mine were store-bought, but hers were made from scratch. The college acceptance where I got a nod, and she had a party. I was used to playing in the background, but this wasn't just favoritism, this was theft. And the worst part, they didn't even tell me. I needed answers. I needed to understand why the people who raised me thought it was okay to erase my future and call it generosity for someone else. That night, I called my mom. She didn't answer. I left a message, my voice shaken but calm, asking if she could talk the next day. No reply. The following morning, I drove to their house, my childhood home. I half expected her to open the door with a smile, to act like nothing happened, but she didn't even seem surprised when she saw me. "Oh, honey," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "We knew you'd be upset." That phrase, "we knew you'd be upset," echoed in my mind like a slap. As if they'd done the math, weighed my anger against Evelyn's happiness, and decided my voice didn't matter. I stood in the foyer, staring at the framed photos on the wall, family vacations, school dances, Evelyn's engagement shoot already taking up center stage. My own college graduation photo had quietly disappeared from the hallway. "I wasn't even told," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. "That money was mine." Mom's smile wavered. "But you're not even dating anyone, sweetheart. Evelyn's getting married. It's a once-in-a-lifetime moment." "Exactly," I said, breath catching. "Her moment, not mine. And you took my moment to pay for hers." Dad appeared behind her, arms folded. "You're being selfish, Natalie. It's just money." That was it. That's when something snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked out. It was the first time I realized that distance might be the only form of protection I had left. But just as I reached the porch steps, Evelyn pulled up in her fiancé's silver car. She stepped out, beaming, holding swatches of ivory fabric. "Natalie, I was just about to text you. We wanted your opinion on table linens." She paused, catching the look on my face. "Is everything okay?" I looked at her, the perfect daughter, the bride-to-be, the reason I no longer had a future I'd worked for. And I said the only thing I could. "They used my house savings for your wedding, Evelyn." She blinked, then laughed like it was a joke. But when I didn't smile, her expression shifted. I didn't know," she said softly. I didn't respond. I walked past her and got in my car, hands steady this time, because if they thought that was the end of the story, they were wrong. When I moved back into my childhood bedroom, I thought the hardest part would be adjusting to the smaller bed and the creaky ceiling fan. I was wrong. The hardest part was seeing my sister's wedding invitations on the fridge, paid for with what should have been my house down payment. Mom had taped it there, dead center. "Isn't it beautiful?" she beamed one morning while handing me a lukewarm cup of coffee. Evelyn's name shimmered in gold script, beside the name of her fiancé, Mark, whom I'd never met. I took a slow sip and forced a nod. "Did you get these printed already?" "Oh, yes," Mom said, turning back to the stove like nothing was wrong. "We used part of your dad's emergency funds, from the family account." Evelyn didn't want anything too flashy, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Once in a lifetime. The words hung in the air like steam off the frying pan. I didn't say a word. Instead, I set the cup down and walked out to the porch where Dad was hosing down the front walkway. He looked up with his usual half smile. "Morning, sweetheart." "Morning," I replied. Then I asked as casually as I could, "Did you know the house savings account is empty?" He paused. "What do you mean?" "I logged in last night. It's gone, the whole thing, all $38,000. He frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We had to help your sister, Natalie. She's getting married. These things aren't cheap." "I wasn't expecting you to pay for my house," I said, barely keeping my voice level. "I saved that money from working double shifts for 3 years. That wasn't yours to touch." Dad sighed like he was the one who'd been wronged. "You're still living here rent-free, aren't you?" That line stuck with me the rest of the day, as if shelter justified theft, as if me needing a temporary place to stay after they drained my savings was proof of my ingratitude. Later that week, Evelyn stopped by with bags of boutique candles and gold place cards, giddy with plans for her garden-themed rehearsal dinner. She greeted me with a tight hug and that sing-song voice she used when she was hiding something. "I just hope it won't rain," she said, flipping through fabric samples at the kitchen table. "Yeah," I said, trying to focus on the scrambled eggs I was making. "That would ruin all the centerpieces you're having flown in." She froze. "What's your problem?" "You're my problem," I said, turning to face her. "You took the money I was saving for a home. You knew it wasn't yours." Her eyes narrowed. "It's not like I held a gun to their heads. Mom and Dad wanted to help. You should be happy for me." "You're right," I said, shaking my head. "I should be thrilled that I'm back in this house eating eggs off plates we've had since 2002 while you plan a $40,000 wedding." She crossed her arms. "You've always been dramatic," I laughed, not because it was funny, but because that was always Evelyn's weapon of choice, dismissal. If I had feelings, I was being dramatic. If I asked for fairness, I was being difficult. I left the kitchen and retreated upstairs, where my old dresser still had stickers from high school. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan spinning just a little off balance. A familiar ache settled in my chest, the kind that reminded me this house was never really home, not for me. Later that evening, I found an old photo album buried in my closet. There we were, Evelyn and I in matching Easter dresses, Dad grilling in the backyard, Mom laughing beside a pile of gifts. I traced the edges of the photos, wondering when things had changed, or maybe they never had. Maybe I'd just stopped pretending. Then I heard the doorbell ring downstairs. A deep voice floated up through the floorboards. "Package for Natalie Blake." I nearly tripped down the stairs. It was a box from a publishing house I'd applied to 6 months ago. I'd forgotten about the essay contest they held for freelance writers. Inside was a letter. "Congratulations, Natalie. Your piece, Home is Not a Place, has been selected for our winter anthology. Enclosed is your first advance." I sank to the floor, letter in hand, heart pounding. For a second, I forgot about the wedding and the bank account and the accusations. I had proof, real printed proof, that my voice mattered. The check was modest, but enough to pay the first month's rent somewhere small, somewhere that was mine. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't proud of what I did next, but I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't angry. Not just angry, tired. Tired of smiling through gritted teeth. Tired of being the reasonable one, the one who always gave in for the sake of peace. So I left a copy of the acceptance letter from the anthology on the fridge. No explanation, no announcement. Just taped it below Evelyn's wedding invitation, like it belonged there too. That evening, I came home from a walk to find Mom sitting at the table, holding the letter like it was evidence in a trial. "You wrote this?" she asked. I nodded, setting my keys down quietly. Her voice trembled. "It's beautiful. I didn't know you were writing again." "Because you never asked," I wanted to say, but I held back. I never stopped. I just stopped talking about it. She placed the letter down, softer this time. "Why didn't you show us earlier?" I shrugged. It didn't seem like it mattered. For once, she didn't argue. Dad came in a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel. He glanced at the letter, then at me. "So you're going to be in a book, huh?" "Looks like it," I said. "That's impressive." There was something else in his voice. Surprise, regret. I couldn't tell, and I didn't ask. I was done fishing for praise that should have come unprompted. The next morning, I visited the public library to work on my next essay. It was quiet, comforting, and smelled like old pages and lemon cleaner. I found a corner table near the window and opened my notebook. But instead of writing, I stared at the blank page for a long while. That's when I noticed him, Mr. Donnelly, the old man who used to run the local hardware store. He sat across the room with a thermos and a yellowing stack of National Geographic magazines. His face was softer now, slower, but his eyes still had that sharp glint of knowing. He spotted me and nodded. I smiled, then stood and walked over. "Still reading about penguins?" He chuckled. "Some habits don't die easy." We talked for a while. He told me his wife had passed last winter. I told him I was writing again. When I mentioned the anthology, he perked up. "You always were the one who watched more than you spoke," he said. "That's a writer's soul, right there." I didn't know why, but his words hit deeper than any of my parents ever had. As I left the library, I noticed a small flyer on the bulletin board: short-term studio rentals, quiet, affordable, safe. A local woman named Mrs. Kavanaugh had converted her garage into 2 small studio apartments and was looking for tenants who didn't mind a cat or a squeaky heater. I took a photo of the number and stood there for a while. I had just enough from my anthology check to cover the deposit and first month's rent. I called her that afternoon. "It's Natalie Blake," I said. "I saw your flyer at the library." Mrs. Kavanaugh was kind, with a voice like chamomile tea. She offered to let me tour the place that evening. I didn't tell Mom and Dad. Instead, I borrowed the car and drove out to a quiet street lined with maple trees losing their leaves. The studio was small but full of charm: wooden beams, a tiny kitchenette, and a narrow window that looked out onto a row of bird feeders. It wasn't much, but it was mine. "I'll take it," I said. Mrs. Kavanaugh smiled, her cat curling around her legs. "I like people who make quick decisions." When I got home that night, Evelyn was in the living room, arguing with Mom about the seating chart. I walked straight upstairs and began packing a single suitcase. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't slam doors or scream accusations. I folded clothes, stacked my notebooks, and zipped it up. Before I left, I slipped a note onto the kitchen table. "Thanks for letting me stay. I found a place. I'm moving out tomorrow. Natalie." No guilt, no apologies, just facts. I didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in months, it wasn't because of stress. It was something else, something like hope. The next morning, Dad was the only one awake when I carried my suitcase downstairs. He looked at me, then at the bag. "You're really going?" "I am." He nodded slowly, then pulled out his wallet and took out a $50 bill. "For gas." I hesitated, but took it. "Thanks." He opened the door for me. "Be safe, kiddo." I walked out into the chill of early November, leaves skittering across the driveway, air sharp with the promise of winter. As I started the engine and backed out, I caught a glimpse of Evelyn through the living room window. She was holding her phone and laughing at something, utterly unaware. I didn't wave, I didn't honk. I didn't expect anyone to visit me at the studio, let alone Evelyn. It had been 2 weeks since I moved into Mrs. Kavanaugh's cozy little unit behind her house. My days settled into a quiet rhythm: mornings with a mug of black coffee by the window, afternoons at the library or the small park nearby, and evenings spent writing under the soft hum of the wall heater. There was something healing about being in a space that was truly mine. I hung string lights, placed a thrifted armchair in the corner, and even started baking again. Simple things like banana bread and oatmeal cookies, the kind of recipes Grandma used to make with me before life got loud. The phone stayed mostly silent. My parents sent a few short texts asking if I was safe. Evelyn? Nothing. Not even a typo-riddled K or a passive-aggressive emoji. So when she showed up at my door one windy afternoon, wearing oversized sunglasses and a pea coat she clearly didn't want, wrinkled, I almost didn't answer. She knocked again, 3 sharp raps. I opened the door just wide enough to see her, but not wide enough to invite her in. "Natalie," she said, breath puffing out like steam, "can we talk?" I looked her over. She didn't seem upset, just tense, like someone forcing herself through an uncomfortable errand. I stepped aside. 5 minutes. She walked in like she was afraid the walls might crumble. Her eyes swept over the space, my tiny kitchen, the books stacked on crates, the makeshift curtain I'd hung over the closet. "You live here?" "I do." She turned to me, her voice tight. "Why didn't you tell me you moved out?" I raised an eyebrow. "I left a note." "You were too busy with napkin colors to notice." "That's not fair," she shot back. "You didn't say anything to me, just disappeared." "And what exactly would you have said, Evelyn?" I crossed my arms. "Would you have told me how selfish I was again?" She flinched just slightly. Then she sighed and sank onto the armchair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "Look, I didn't come here to fight." I didn't sit down. "Then why are you here?" She fiddled with a ring on her finger. "Because I talked to Mom. She told me about your writing, the anthology, the check." "So that was it." I nodded slowly. "Let me guess. Suddenly I'm not such a disappointment." Her eyes widened. "Number Natalie." "That's not what I meant." I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms still crossed. "Then what did you mean?" She hesitated. "I didn't know you were doing something that mattered to you. I always thought you were the one who didn't need much. You never complained. That doesn't mean I was fine. I know that now." The silence that followed was thick and strange, like stepping into a room where something important had just happened. I didn't know if I was supposed to forgive her. I wasn't ready for that. But I also didn't want to hold this weight forever. "I'm not coming back," I said finally. "I didn't ask you to." She stood and walked to the door, then turned back. "But you should know, Mom's been different since you left. Quieter. She baked yesterday, from scratch." That startled me more than I'd admit. "Banana bread?" Evelyn gave a dry laugh. "Yeah." After she left, I sat down at the tiny table by the window and pulled out my notebook. But I didn't write. I just watched the wind knock over the neighbor's plastic flamingo and wondered if something had shifted, not just in the air, but in our story. 2 days later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name printed carefully in blue ink. Inside was a folded note and a check. The note read, "For what was taken without asking. I'm sorry. Mom." The check was for $3,000. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the full amount they'd taken from my house fund, not even close, but it was something, a gesture, an acknowledgement. I didn't cash it, not yet, but I tucked it into my notebook, behind the page where I'd written about the day I left home. That evening, I ran into Mrs. Kavanaugh in the driveway. She was wearing gardening gloves and holding a half-dead fern. "Looks like your sister came by," she said, not unkindly. "She did. She brings trouble." I shook my head. "Not exactly, just history." She grinned. "Well, history's good fertilizer if you use it right." I smiled, thinking of that check, of Evelyn in my armchair, of Mom baking banana bread again. But the past isn't done with me yet. The cafe was smaller than I expected, tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat, with faded red awnings and mismatched chairs that looked like they'd come from someone's grandma's attic. It was charming in that slow, lived-in kind of way, the kind of place where no one rushed their coffee. I stepped inside, clutching my portfolio a little too tightly. The bell over the door gave a cheerful jingle, but my stomach was in knots. This was it, my first in-person meeting as a writer, and it felt like I'd just walked into a test I didn't study for. The editor, Josie Larkin, was already at a corner table with a half-drunk latte and a thick manila folder in front of her. She looked exactly like her email sounded, direct, sharp, but not unkind. "Natalie Blake," she said with a smile, standing to shake my hand. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," I managed, sliding into the chair across from her. She tapped the folder. "I've read your piece 3 times now. The quiet corner. It stays with you." I blinked. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would—" Josie held up a hand. "You don't need to downplay it. It's good, really good." She opened the folder and pulled out a printed copy of my essay, now marked with neat handwritten notes in the margins. "The way you describe your family, it's painful, but there's a softness to it, like you're still hoping they'll understand you." I looked away, embarrassed by how true that was. Josie leaned forward. "I'd like to feature your piece as the opening essay in the anthology, but I also want to talk about something else." I nodded, waiting. "We're putting together a speaking panel this winter," she said. "Writers sharing their stories of resilience, small-town voices, big truths. I think you'd be perfect." My brain sputtered. "Me? Speak? In public?" "You," she said. "You have something people need to hear." I stared at the chipped tabletop. I'd spent most of my life being the quiet one, the dependable one, the background extra in Evelyn's glittery lead role, and now someone wanted me to speak. "I'll think about it," I said softly. "Good," Josie smiled. "No pressure, just think about it." After we wrapped up, she handed me a sealed envelope. "Your contributor payment. It's not much, but it's honest." I slipped it into my coat pocket, still feeling like I was watching all this happen to someone else. When I got home, Mrs. Kavanaugh was pruning her rose bushes. "Well?" she called over the fence. "Did they hate it?" I shook my head, grinning. "They loved it." She smiled like she already knew. "I told you, quiet folks often write the loudest truths." Later that night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $2,000, twice what I expected. There was also a handwritten note from Josie. "Let this be the beginning, not the validation. You've always been enough. This just proves it to the world." I stared at it for a long time. Then I reached into my notebook and pulled out the check from Mom. I hadn't decided what to do with it, but now I had an idea. The next morning, I walked to the local bank and opened a savings account. I deposited both checks under my name, no co-signers, no shared access, just mine. That afternoon, I texted Evelyn. "Hey, I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not coming back either. I hope your wedding is beautiful." She replied 2 hours later, "It's not the same without you, but I understand. I hope you're happy." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was honest. I folded the exchange into the back pages of my journal and then pulled out a blank one. A fresh start. Then, just before dinner, my phone rang. It was Mom. Mom's voice sounded softer than I remembered, not apologetic, not warm exactly, but stripped of its usual edge, like she'd finally run out of angles. "We read your essay, Natalie, and I think we need to talk." I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched across the phone like a tightrope. I finally said, "What part did you like best? The betrayal or the guilt?" She exhaled a shaky breath. "That's fair." I waited. "I didn't know you felt all of that," she said. "I didn't see it." "No," I said. "You didn't want to." There was a pause. "Your father and I, we didn't handle things well. With the money, with you." "Mom, it wasn't just the money," I said. "It was always Evelyn first. Always. And when I finally stood up for myself, you called me selfish." I could hear her trying not to cry. "You were never selfish. You were just invisible to us. That's worse." My throat tightened. I hadn't expected her to admit that. "We want to make it right," she said. I almost laughed. "You can't." "But we want to try," she insisted. "Please, come by the house, just once. No expectations." I told her I'd think about it. Then I hung up and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The next morning, I went for a walk. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the wind smelled like chimney smoke and apples. I passed the diner where Dad used to take Evelyn for milkshakes, and barely remembered if I'd ever gotten one too. Mrs. Kavanaugh was out on her porch when I got back. She held up a thermos of coffee like an offering. "Your folks call?" she asked, like she somehow knew. I nodded. She handed me the thermos. "Don't go back for closure. Go back if you want clarity." "What's the difference?" I asked. "Closure is their word. Clarity's yours." The next day, I drove out to my childhood home. The porch looked smaller, the garden overgrown. Evelyn's car was already there, still spotless, still too perfect. Inside, the living room looked just the same, family portraits on the mantel, none of them with me past high school. Mom offered me tea. Dad stayed quiet. We sat down at the dining table. "I read your story," Dad said. "Twice." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know how badly we hurt you," he continued, "but I believe you." It wasn't flowery, but it was the most I'd ever gotten from him. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "This is yours." Inside was a certified check for the exact amount I'd saved before, the money they'd taken for her wedding. "It's not about the money anymore," I said. "I know," Evelyn said, "but you deserve better. I'm sorry." I looked at my parents. "Do you believe that too?" Mom's lips trembled. "Yes," I nodded. "Then I accept the apology, but I'm still keeping my distance." They didn't argue. That was new. When I got home, Josie's email was waiting. Subject: ready? Body. "Panels in 2 weeks. You're our headliner. Are you still in?" I replied, yes. 2 weeks later, I stood on a small stage in the back of an old library. String lights hung from the rafters. A dozen folding chairs faced me, filled with strangers who'd read my words and wanted more. I talked about the silence of growing up in someone else's shadow, about the price of being a good daughter, about finding a voice I didn't know I had. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then came applause, soft but real. Afterward, a woman maybe in her 70s came up and hugged me without asking. "You reminded me of my own daughter," she said. "I just hope she forgives me someday." That night, I walked home with my shoes in my hands, the pavement still warm from the day. I didn't get justice, not exactly, but I got something better, peace, and somehow, in letting go, I finally felt seen. I never thought that by speaking up, I'd be seen. Not in the loud, showy way, but in the quiet places where truth finally settles. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for others is to let them face who they were, and for ourselves, to step forward anyway. Because when we stop judging others and begin showing up with kindness, even the most broken bridges can find their way back to the light. So if this story touched something in you, maybe pass it along, not for me, but for someone still waiting to be heard.